In early June 1942, the USA Navy ambushed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers near Midway Atoll and sank every single one of them. It was one of the most decisive naval victories of the 20th century. At least that's what the history books celebrate. What they spend less time on is how the Navy knew exactly where those carriers would be, when they'd arrive, and which direction they'd come from, all from a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor where a team of codebreakers was reading barely 10% of Japan's encrypted radio traffic. How does a team reading fragments of one message in 10 manage to call the timing and location of a major enemy offensive? That question leads back to the 14th Naval District Headquarters building at Pearl Harbor and a basement room that most people on base didn't even know existed. The unit working in that room was the Combat Intelligence Unit, known informally as Station High-Po. It was run by Commander Joseph Rochefort, who reported officially to the Navy's Washington Code-Breaking Office, OP-20G, but who also maintained a direct back channel to Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer Edwin Layton. Layton briefed Admiral Chester Nimitz in person, which meant Rochefort's analysis could reach the fleet commander's desk without being filtered through Washington first. That direct channel would matter enormously in the weeks ahead, because Rochefort was about to produce intelligence that Washington's own codebreakers would flat out reject. The code they were working against was called JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's main operational cipher. If you've ever tried to decode a transmission on the air and had to work through layers of interference just to pull the signal out of the noise, imagine that problem scaled to an industrial level and made deliberately harder. JN-25 worked in 2 layers, each one designed to make interception alone completely useless. The first layer was a codebook containing tens of thousands of 5-digit number groups, each one standing in for a specific word or phrase. The second layer was a separate table of random 5-digit additive numbers that got added to the codebook figures before a message was ever transmitted. So to read even one intercepted message, Rochefort's team first had to strip off the additive layer mathematically, and then figure out what the underlying codebook numbers actually meant by tracking patterns across thousands of prior intercepts. By the spring of 1942, Station High-Po was processing somewhere between several hundred and over 1,000 intercepted Japanese naval messages every single day. And out of all that volume, they were breaking and actually reading roughly 10 to 15%, a figure confirmed independently by both the National Security Agency's own published history and by the Naval History and Heritage Command's official account. Even then, what they recovered was often only fragments of a message body rather than a clean, complete text. That was only the raw material they had to work with, and the puzzle they were trying to solve was about to get much harder. Starting in the spring of 1942, intercepted Japanese messages kept referencing a forthcoming operation against a target the Japanese designated AF. Rochefort's team cross-referenced the partly solved geographic code designators they'd built up over months and concluded that AF was Midway Atoll. Rochefort communicated this assessment to Nimitz and Admiral King as early as March 10, 1942. Washington wasn't buying it, and the disagreement would have real consequences for the entire Pacific Fleet. Analysts at OP-20G, the Navy's own code-breaking headquarters on the other side of the country, favored entirely different targets, including the Aleutian Islands, Johnston Island, and even the American West Coast. 2 intelligence organizations inside the same military, looking at the same intercepted traffic, reaching opposite conclusions about where the Japanese planned to strike next. If Nimitz committed his carriers to defend the wrong location, the Pacific Fleet's remaining striking power would be out of position when the real attack came. Rochefort needed proof, and he devised one of the more elegant intelligence operations of the entire war. With Nimitz's approval, Station Hypo arranged for Midway's garrison to radio an uncoded message reporting that the base's freshwater distillation equipment had broken down. The message was sent in the clear so Japanese signals intelligence operators would pick it up. It was bait, broadcast on an open frequency specifically to be intercepted. Japanese signals intelligence operators intercepted the transmission exactly as Rochefort had expected. And within a short window of time, they transmitted their own encrypted message referencing the fact that AF was short of fresh water. When Rochefort's team decrypted that follow-up, the test was over. AF was Midway, and the debate was settled. This sequence is one of the most thoroughly documented events in the entire story, confirmed by at least 7 independent sources, including the NSA's official history, the Naval History and Heritage Command, the U.S. Naval Institute, and the National World War II Museum. And here's a correction worth noting, because popular retellings often get this part wrong. A lot of older documentaries frame the water ruse as the moment Nimitz himself became convinced that Midway was the target. That's not what the best available evidence supports. According to both the Navy's own official historian, Samuel Cox at the Naval History and Heritage Command, and a detailed 2026 Naval Institute account, Nimitz and Rochefort were already confident in the Midway assessment before the water trick was ever sent. The ruse was aimed at convincing skeptical officers in Washington who were pushing alternative theories, not at persuading the fleet commander who already agreed. But confirming the target was only half the intelligence problem they still had to solve. Station Hypo's estimate for the timing of the attack was late May to early June. Washington's analysts at OP-20G were saying late June. If Nimitz positioned his fleet based on the wrong date, his carriers would either arrive too early and be spotted by Japanese reconnaissance, or arrive too late and miss the attack entirely. According to the Naval Institute's account, the whole timing question came down to one stubborn 5-digit code group that Rochefort's analysts worked on for roughly a week before they finally cracked it. On May 27, 1942, they broke the date and time indicator, and Rochefort was able to brief Nimitz with a specific forecast. The approach bearing the Japanese fleet would use, the distance from which they'd launch, and the approximate hour they'd begin the attack. That briefing came 8 days before the battle. In less than a week, Nimitz would find out whether Rochefort's forecast was right, or whether he'd just committed his 3 available aircraft carriers to the wrong place at the wrong time based on partial decrypts from a code his team could barely read. Acting on that intelligence, Nimitz positioned task forces 16 and 17, carrying the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, at a point northeast of Midway Atoll, designated Point Luck. He didn't station them to defend the atoll head-on. He placed them where they could ambush the incoming Japanese force from a direction the Japanese weren't watching. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft launched their strike against Midway's airstrip and shore defenses. While that attack was underway, American carrier planes found the Japanese fleet and struck from above while the Japanese carrier decks were cluttered with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for a second wave. The result was devastating for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japan lost all 4 fleet carriers committed to the operation, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They also lost a heavy cruiser, hundreds of aircraft, and approximately 3,057 personnel. The United States lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 144 aircraft, and approximately 362 personnel. Going into the battle, the American Battle Monuments Commission puts the U.S. air strength at roughly 360 total aircraft, about 130 land-based on Midway and 230 aboard the 3 carriers, against roughly 250 Japanese aircraft aboard their 4 carriers. Nimitz committed his entire available carrier force to an ambush position based on fragmentary intelligence from a code-breaking team that was reading maybe 1 out of every 7 to 10 enemy messages. Whether you call that extraordinary trust in his intelligence officers or a strategic gamble born of having no better option, the outcome validated it completely. The codebreakers won the battle, and what happened to them afterward is a different kind of story entirely. Shortly after Midway, Rochefort was recalled from Pearl Harbor to Washington under a pretext and never returned to code-breaking work. The Navy gave him command of a floating dry dock, which is about as far from intelligence work as you can get while still being in the Navy. Nimitz had recommended Rochefort for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal in June 1942, and Admiral Ernest King denied it outright. Both the Naval History and Heritage Command and the U.S. Naval Institute attribute the denial to bureaucratic rivalry between Pearl Harbor and Washington. Officers at OP-20G in Washington, specifically brothers John and Joseph Redmond, lobbied against singling out Rochefort because doing so would have undercut their own competing claims to credit for the intelligence that made Midway possible. The man who got the analysis right had his recognition blocked by the people whose analysis had been wrong. Rochefort never received the medal in his lifetime, and he died in 1976 without it ever being revisited. It took a decades-long advocacy campaign led by one of his former Station Hypo colleagues, Rear Admiral Donald "Mac" Showers, to finally get the award approved. The Distinguished Service Medal was authorized in 1985, more than 40 years after the battle. On May 30, 1986, President Ronald Reagan presented it posthumously to Rochefort's children at a ceremony in the White House. 44 years had passed between the battle and that moment, and Rochefort himself had been dead for a decade by then. But the fragmentary intercepts his team decoded in that Pearl Harbor basement, 5-digit code groups pulled from Japanese naval radio traffic and painstakingly worked over by hand until they gave up their meaning, had already reshaped how the American military valued signals intelligence for the rest of the century.